Hi everyone, it's Laura here, and in today's video I'm going to share with you how to create a very quick and easy floral card using stamps by Altenew and Distress Oxide sprays. Let's have a quick look at the products that I'll be using today. We have this beautiful stamp set by Altenew. This is called Cherished Memories and it features some gorgeous florals and some beautiful sentiments too. I used the coordinating dies to die cut my images. For my sentiment, I used the fancy Hello die, also by Altenew. I absolutely love the style of this font. And then I used the leaf frame cover die, also by Altenew, and this added really quickly a lot of interest and detail to my background. The first step was to use this die to die cut some watercolor cardstock. This one here is by Crafter's Companion and I love to use it especially for ink blending because it's bright white, so it matches nicely when I use, for example, Nina Solar White 110 pounds cardstock for my alcohol markers colored images. Because the die is so intricate, I'm using this very handy tool to first poke out all the die cuts that I'm not going to use and then to basically remove the frame from the die. At this point, I put my background aside because I wasn't entirely sure what my color palette was going to be for the background, and I moved on and started working on my images to set my color palette basically. I'm stamping them with alcohol-proof black ink by Spectrum Noir on some Nina Solar White 110 pounds cardstock. I'm using my Mini Misty and stamping a couple of times so that I get nice and crisp black lines, and then I can go ahead and start coloring the images. There isn't a lot of coloring today because we have just the flower and the two leaves, so everything is super quick and easy. I'm using my Illustrator markers and I'm going to use a little bit of an unusual color palette for me today. It's nice sometimes to get out of our comfort zone and try new things, and I have to say that I was especially happy with how this card turned out. I started with my lightest marker and I used it to define the areas where I wanted the shadows before going in with a darker blue marker and actually darken up those areas. I'm using flicking motions with my wrist to create those brush strokes, basically with the brush tip of my Illustrator marker, and I'm using the lines that are drawn by the Illustrator inside the petals to figure out in which direction I have to add my brush strokes. So these lines are not only a great detail and very aesthetically pleasing in my opinion, but they are also a good help in placing the shadows correctly and giving them the right shape. Once I was done adding my highlights, I blended them out with my midtone, leaving some space for the highlights that I filled in with my TB1 marker. I left the tips of the petals white and you will see why in a little bit. But the next step was to increase the contrast in the floral a little bit more, so I added a darker marker, my TB8 marker, to the very center of the flower and the base of the petals, so that I get that nice contrast and dimension in my image. And then I blended everything out using those same markers as before, which by the way will all be listed in the blog post that you will find linked in the description box down below. Speaking of blog posts, this card is part of a hop to celebrate Altenew's 6th anniversary, so there is a lot of inspiration and there are giveaways too, and you can find all the information in the blog post that, as I said, is linked in the description box for you. I also wanted to let you know that Altenew is doing a lot of charity right now in these difficult times. They released recently a video explaining everything they're doing to help the community. So if you haven't watched it already, I recommend you check it out. I will leave a link to the video as well in the description box down below. I think it's always great and inspiring to see how the crafting community is always so ready to give back. Coming back to the card, I decided to add a little bit of color variation by coloring the tips of the petals with a lavender marker. And this is the reason why when I was adding my highlights with my light blue marker, I didn't go all the way towards the tips of the petals, but I left a little bit of white space to add these highlights and these color accents at a later stage. I then moved on and started coloring my leaves, and I wanted to create sort of a high contrast color palette, so I went for these golden yellows. I've been experimenting with the color palettes for my floral cards lately, using a bit of a less realistic color palette for my cards, and I have been loving the results, to be honest. I have another one that I created with Altenew stamps, and I will link to it in the description box down below, and there will be a card popping up on your screen right now as well, so you can check it out if you're interested. Once I was done coloring my images, I secured my dies in place using some purple tape, and then I ran everything through my die cutting machine to cut out the images. At this point, because I had an idea of what the color palette was going to be, I knew what I wanted to do for my background. So I took the panel that I had die cut with the leaf frame cover die, and I used my distress inks in different shades of yellow and orange to add some color and texture. I'm using my blending brushes, these are by Ranger, to add color here and there. I'm not trying to get a homogeneous look at all. And then I also decided to just directly swipe my distress ink cubes very lightly onto my background to create even more texture. And if it's a little bit too harsh, I can also go in with my brush and smoothen out those stripes that I'm creating with the ink pads. This is a very quick way to create a lot of interest on your panels, and it's also really fun. This is the final result. I was checking that everything looked nice and I had the color depth that I wanted on that die cut. And then the next step was to finish off my background. I'm going to use a very simple technique to add a lot of texture and interest to the background, and for that I'm using Distress Oxide sprays. I'm using tumbled glass at the moment and spraying it lightly on the background, also rotating my sheet so that it doesn't look like the oxide spray is coming from one direction only and the pattern is a little bit more random. I dried this first layer and then I added a second layer with Distress Oxide spray in chipped sapphire, this time being a little bit less generous because I didn't want the background to be too dark and I still wanted a lot of that white cardstock showing through. By the way, the cardstock that I used for my Distress Oxide spray background is again watercolor cardstock by Crafter's Companion that's going to withstand that moisture really nicely. And then I went ahead and started adhering everything. I glued down my frame to my background, holding it down with some heavy acrylic blocks until my glue dried, and then I could go ahead and adhere my florals too. I secured them in place with some purple tape so that I was sure I have the position and the arrangement that I want with my flower and my leaves, and then I glued them to the background using again Nouveau Deluxe adhesive. I stamped my sentiment on some white cardstock using a blue ink that coordinated more or less with the shades of blue that I have on my background, and I'm trimming it down into a thin banner using my guillotine trimmer by Tonic Studios. I also wanted to round the corners of this banner, so I'm using my corner chomper on the 1/4 of an inch side, and I only rounded the top left and bottom right corners of my banner to give it a bit of an interesting shape. The last part of the greeting is this beautiful hello die cut, also created with a die by Altenew. I decided to die cut it from some blue as well as some white cardstock, and I'm stacking the two die cuts together, just slightly shifting them with respect to each other so that I created a drop shadow effect, and this white border is going to help me make the die cut stand out a little bit more from the background. I glued it down onto my card base, overlapping it a little bit with the sentiment banner, and then for a finishing touch I added some highlights to the petals of the flower using a Sakura Jelly Roll pen in the size 10. This is a white gel pen. And because the center of the flower was so dark, I had lost a little bit of the detail of the stems, so I'm going to bring it back in by adding a few strokes, again using this white Jelly Roll pen, as well as a few dots on the top of the stems. I adhered everything to a card base. This is a pre-cut and pre-scored card base that is made out of some Nina Solar White 80 pounds cardstock, and I am going to use some double-sided tape to adhere the card front to the card base. I generally make my own card bases, but having these pre-cut and pre-scored ones is really convenient, I have to say. And here is the final result. Don't forget that this card is part of a blog hop with giveaways, and you will find a link to my stop in the hop in the description box down below. As always, if you did enjoy the video, make sure to let me know with a thumbs up and a comment in the comment section down below. And if you're new here and you haven't already, you can subscribe for more card making and paper crafting inspiration. As always, thank you all so much for stopping by, stay safe and have a great day.